The following video is for educational purposes only. Do not attempt to replicate any of the stories or betting strategies discussed in this video. If you have or know someone with a gambling addiction, please seek help immediately. Rising Up from Rock Bottom by Ian Brett, July 14th, 2022. I had my first drink at 4 years old. When I was 9, I found a job sweeping a panel floor shop. I'd get Dad to put 50-cent bets on for me. A win gave me a bit of a high. By the time I was 14, I had 3 part-time jobs, and people in the tab gambling shop would put bets on for me. I left school at 15 and was earning as much as men, then losing it all every weekend. Then I was introduced to the casino in Queensland, moved north, and got hooked on blackjack. I'd stash $200 under my seat covers to keep me going through the week. I was gambling to feel like I was a winner. The more money I had, the more I gambled. It was like a seesaw with highs and lows while moving between Brisbane, where I was self-employed, and Melbourne, where the pay was better. I had a drug-induced breakdown in Melbourne while I was in a circle of friends who were smoking and dealing. 6 months after the breakdown, I got done for aggravated burglary and ended up in a rehab unit where we shopped and cooked for ourselves. It was the best thing that could have happened because it got me off drugs and alcohol and got me integrated back into society with a full-time job. By the time I was out on parole, the casino in Melbourne was open, but I was seeing a psychologist and I was doing well for a time. I was buying a house and land package deal, but by the day I had to sign the papers, I had no job, no severance pay, and no unemployment benefits. I was back into gambling and in a downward spiral. I wasn't in my right mind and did a runner from a petrol station. Then I tried to hold up another petrol station with a club lock under my jacket, and the armed robbery squad pulled up next to me. My house and car were repossessed, and I did 2 weeks in jail. My dad and sister wrote me off, but my mom visited me. I got bail and moved back home, although my mom was frightened I was going to take off. I lost my license, got a 4-year good behavior bond, and a 12-month community corrections order that involved horticulture work for the council, which I enjoyed, both the work and the camaraderie. A condition of bail was to not go to the casino, but it was the first thing I did. I went to Gambler's Help in the 1990s, but I wasn't ready. Around 2000, I gave up marijuana cold turkey as my New Year's resolution. In 2008, I gave up smoking cold turkey. In 2013, I self-excluded from the casino, but I kept going in when I had money. In 2015, I approached Gambler's Help for the second time while also trying some controlled poker playing, which, surprise, didn't work. I suffered a lot of anxiety, and the counselor helped me with mindfulness strategies. She showed me how to budget by putting my money in envelopes, marked with the days of the week. From there, I got involved with Peer Connection, which is a gambling support group. My contact would ring me, we could talk about gambling, and he understood. Then I joined a social group, where there were more people to connect with and things to do. A doctor and a nurse did a talk about neuroplasticity and how we're always learning, and that's me now. I've had 35 years of bad habits to change, but now I'm doing positive things to help others so they don't have to hit rock bottom like I did. It's been a hard way to learn. As a speaker at the gambling support group, I talked about gambling, but also the mental health side. I can speak in front of a group. I've overcome phobias and addictions. Gambling wasn't about the money, but about winning enough to keep the gambling addiction fed. I stopped gambling in 2017. I had a win at the horse races, knew it was a fluke, and put the money in the bank. That's me. I'm done. I now feel a sense of purpose. I support charities. I'm involved with the local football club, the Wilderness Society, and Clean Up Australia Day. I got to know my neighbors during lockdown from walking my dog, Bindi. I'm finally part of the community, and that's what it's all about.
Okay, so I wanted to just quickly go over Ian's story. And the first thing that really stood out to me was how he started so young and that his dad was placing bets for him even when he was just 14 years old. And what's also interesting was that Ian sort of mentioned this idea of neuroplasticity towards the end of the story. Now, he didn't really go into detail too much into what neuroplasticity is. And the way you can think about this word is that it's the rewiring of your brain's ability to just change and grow. Now, if you've watched any of my other previous videos on psychedelics, this is related to neuroplasticity and how you can kind of rewire your brain and overcome this addictive behavior. Now, there was another great quote here by Ian, and it was that gambling wasn't about the money, but it was about winning enough to keep the addiction fed. And I found this to be incredibly profound because whenever you're in that haze of gambling addiction and you're just betting, there is no amount of money that you can win. That's not really the goal. The goal is that you just want to keep playing and keep that dopamine rush fed. Now, the way that Ian overcame his gambling addiction was to keep busy. He started supporting charities, playing football, and joined this Wilderness Society, and even participated in this cleanup day for his community. But overall, this was an interesting story and sort of teaches you how a gambling addiction can start really young and take up the majority of your life.
Learning from the Mistakes of Gambling by Steve, May 5th, 2022. I had lots of happy-go-lucky times with my friends, having beers at the golf club where there was an online gambling shop. I remember my friend putting a $2 bet that was on 101 odds, and he threw all the money in the air when he won. They were good, fun times, going back about 15 years ago when I was in my 20s. That friend has always been amazingly disciplined at setting limits, but I'd go to the casino and lose 50% of my income. I'd wonder what I was doing by spending more than I could afford. But I also told myself that it wasn't impacting my life in any major way and I could stop if I wanted to. The best barrier for me was that physically going to the gambling shop or casino was an effort. I got my first teaching job in 2007 and I didn't really have an issue with gambling for about 10 years until I started using apps on my phone. I joined a Facebook subscription group that would give you tips, but I couldn't just stick to those tips. I'd gamble outside of them too. I love the NBA, the National Basketball Association, and was watching it daily. Putting a bet on it kept it interesting. It was all about the green numbers on the app. The real danger was how easy it was to hide my betting. It didn't arouse any suspicion, and betting anonymously covered up my guilt and shame. I was also using alcohol and recreational drugs to deal with my feelings. I maxed out credit cards, but I thought I was good at covering my tracks. I became a cunning liar, someone who wasn't me. But I honestly believed I'd be able to make the money back. I used to tell myself, "You got yourself into this mess, and now you have to get yourself out." Then there came a debt I couldn't pay, and I had to tell my wife. I saw a gambling counselor, but I became complacent pretty quickly. I was only doing it because my wife wanted me to, and that never works. The drive has to come from the person. I did see one counselor regularly, but there were a few relapses in that time. I worked towards telling my family about my gambling, but I'd been betting the day we visited, so I wasn't really coming clean or owning up. My brother and sister were a lot more supportive than I thought they'd be. My father, though, he was shocked and angry, but most of all, he was disappointed. That's worse than anger, and it's been one of the hardest things for me to take on board. I was brought up with all the privileges available, but it doesn't matter who you are. I have to be on guard every day. The best measures for me have been no access to credit cards, and I have a gambling ban on my phone. My wife is in control of our money, and I'm okay with that. I've created the situation, so you have to reap what you sow. There's no silver bullet. You don't initially believe that you're an addict for life. I've worked with a psychologist on my urges and triggers. I don't watch the NBA anymore. I don't drive past the gambling shops. If I feel an urge, I give someone a call or go for a run. I had a relapse last year, but I didn't let it get me down or take me off track. You have to pick yourself up and try again. The day you stop trying is the day you lose. If nothing changes, nothing changes. Relapses make you more self-aware for the next time, so you can focus on heading off any of those next times. I now have a growth mindset where I'm determined to learn from my mistakes. Keep telling yourself to keep doing the right thing. I work really hard at living a good life with my wife, where we have open communication. Sport is in there as a positive. I play golf and tennis, and I've run a marathon. I haven't put on the footy boots for over 20 years, but I'm a passionate football supporter. I'm also a high school sports coordinator for boys 7 to 9. I've heard the 12-year-old boys talking about sports betting, and I said, be careful with what you're doing.
Okay, so Steve's story actually hit pretty close to home when he talked about his love for the NBA and betting on basketball games, as this is something that happened in my own life. I used to love watching the NBA and sports betting and betting on FanDuel and DraftKings and betting on the money line and anything related to sports betting with basketball. And what's interesting is that Steve had a friend who could gamble responsibly, and he sort of seemed to admire that, but eventually we found out that Steve was not like his friend and he wasn't able to control his betting. Another interesting point from this story was that Steve mentioned that the real danger was hiding your betting and how he could do this anonymously. And this is incredibly important because no one around you can see what you're doing. If you're able to place bets anonymously, or on your phone, or through a bookie, or on a website, your friends won't know, your family won't know, and no one really sees what you're doing. Now, there was a great point here where Steve talked about how he received support from his family, specifically his brother and his sister. Whenever you are going through the demons or the shadows of a gambling addiction, you feel like you're alone, you feel isolated, and it feels like no one can help you. But you'll be pleasantly surprised if you just reach out to family or friends that care about you and love you at how supportive they really will be. Now, of course, to wrap this story up, the way that Steve eventually overcame his bad habits of betting was to focus more on being a teacher, playing golf, playing tennis, and running marathons.
Full Steam Ahead to Recovery by Patrick McCarthy, October 14th, 2021. I was in high school when the first slot machines came out, and I'd head over to go play. I'd go to the club with my parents on a Friday night. We'd do road trips with friends to a casino. Gambling was just there, casually in the atmosphere, as if it was no big deal. Except it was. I was hooked as soon as I started. It was a bit of a thrill when you had a win, but it was also not knowing what was coming next. I was totally consumed by it. I'd work all week, then gamble my whole pay away, which I kept a secret. It was an invisible addiction. I became a functioning addict. It's embarrassing to say that this lasted 10 to 15 years, on and off, betting at least half of my entire pay. But then I was in my mid-30s, living a reckless life and $35,000 in debt. You can't keep up, so you isolate yourself, break down in tears, go and see a counselor, and things come good for a while. I'd give up gambling and then be back, full steam ahead. Meanwhile, I was able to really switch it on at work and put in a good effort. I worked for the remote communities in the north where they really love their football. I loved that job, but I was also using it to run away. I remember staying up 2 days straight in the desert, betting first on local sports, but then getting into badminton and ice hockey. I'd gamble with my friends and see them as way worse than me. I was always looking for little scams. I got used to the gambling hangover of crushing disbelief and shame for a few days after a loss. I looked for a gambling counselor that I really clicked with, but if I found one, then I'd gamble again and be too ashamed to go back. I was so caught up in my dark problems. I was leading a double life. It was like a tornado in my mind. Why did I do it? I've seen the effects of gambling on the people around me, people I love. I've lost girlfriends and other relationships to gambling. People get sick of it. They'd ask, "Are you gambling again?" But I got so good at deflecting and turning it around to me being the victim. My attitude was quite aggressive, and then I'd start an argument. What drove the change was that my conscience always got the better of me, and I knew I could be, and was, better than the direction I was heading. My mental health was at an all-time low, living with my parents in my mid-30s, with a baby boy to raise without his mother, and struggling to find rentals with my bad credit history. Slowly, I turned things around. I tried antidepressants. I got reintroduced to running, which I take very seriously, and I'm doing half marathons. I read books, listen to podcasts, and learn to analyze and be emotionally intelligent. I had a gambling slip-up and realized it was triggered by alcohol, so I quit drinking too. I set up an arrangement with my dad to sign off on my spending, but I've got a black tick against my name for 5 years. I am where I am. I beat myself up for so long and put myself through hell. I burned so many bridges, but came to realize that it's only me stopping me. Now I'm present. I'm on the way to a youth work degree. I'm working on being a better dad and a better worker. I'm a sports coordinator at my company, and I love what they stand for. Working brings together my love for running, sports, adventure, and the enjoyment of helping people. I feel like my experience helps me engage with the participants at work. They are raw and honest with their struggles, and that's what's great. We can all learn something from each other. We come together, play sports, and work on our lives together. And then there's my son. We go out in nature with the dog. We might see a sunset or throw rocks at the water and have a talk. It's really simple, but for me, it's everything.
Okay, so there were a couple interesting points from Patrick's story, especially when it comes to the thrill of gambling. And that gambling wasn't the only thrill, it was the not knowing of what was coming next. Now, this is a trap that engulfs a lot of gamblers. It's that what if, that next spin, that jackpot, that bonus, what if you hit it big? What if it's your lucky day and you just win that insane amount of money? And so this is the thrill that Patrick was talking about, which fueled his addiction. Now, another interesting point that Patrick made was that gambling is an invisible addiction, and he was basically a functioning addict because no one around you can see what's happening on the inside. Externally, you look fine, you probably are healthy, there's no physical side effects really, but on the inside, he was suffering and he had this gambling compulsion, gambling addiction at his core. Now, obviously, things began to deteriorate in the story when Patrick mentioned that his mental health was at an all-time low. And part of this was realizing that he was in his mid-30s, in massive amounts of debt, and still living with his parents. Sometimes this realization is what you really need to make that self-assessment of your life and really figure out that it's time to make a change. And that change for Patrick was just concentrating more on his work and being a better dad for his son.
Waking Up to Reality by Terry, October 15th, 2021. Like most Chinese people, I learned about gambling when I was a child. It was fun. As an adult, I was self-disciplined and always planned for my future. In 1991, I became a permanent resident and then a citizen of Australia. As a Chinese teacher in Australia, it was really difficult to earn a good living. I decided to return to Hong Kong, where I'd be able to make enough to later spend my retirement days back in Australia. I started gambling in Hong Kong as a way to relieve the pressure of work. I enjoyed betting on horse races via the telephone betting system, which was very easy to use and could win you a lot of money. At this stage, I usually bet small sums of money with my friends. I clearly remember the day my gambling became an addiction. It was on the 15th of June in 1997, the day of the Triple Trio jackpot at Hong Kong's Happy Valley Racecourse. The race was worth $25.9 million US, and my friends and I had pooled our money on a bet. That day we got very close to winning fourth prize, as a result which would have won us each $1 million. From that day on, I became convinced that betting on horse races was an easy way of making money, much easier than working hard in my job. I believe that if I just had a bit more of luck on June 15th, I would have achieved my retirement goal. As I became addicted to horse race betting, my lifestyle started to change. Every weekend, instead of enjoying time with my wife and children, I stayed home to watch races and place bets. Occasionally, my wife complained, but I felt she did not understand that I was trying my best to prepare us for a return to Australia. I noticed my kids were not talking to me anymore. In reality, it was I who had little time to talk to them. In the beginning, I spent roughly 100 or 200 Hong Kong dollars a week, but soon it increased to 5,000 to 6,000 Hong Kong dollars. I made sure I never spent more than I could afford, and betting the money I lost wasn't noticeably affecting my family's lifestyle. The anticipation of winning a lot of money to retire made me feel excited and allowed me to temporarily forget life's struggles. Occasionally, I would nearly win a large sum and feel relieved by the idea that I was getting closer to my retirement dreams. I believed I only needed a bit of luck to win enough for the retirement I was longing for. The most disappointing thing was, I never won much on horse racing. 10 years went by, and one day in 2007, I decided to sit down and audit my betting results. I found out that I had lost about 500,000 Hong Kong dollars altogether. I had not only moved further away from my retirement goal, but I would need to stay and work in Hong Kong for even longer to reach it. This realization made me decide to give up gambling. I was like a man who had just woken up from a dream, and I suddenly knew that gambling would not help me fulfill my retirement dreams. In the end, nobody forced me to give up betting on horse racing. In fact, I didn't even tell my wife about my decision. I simply changed my lifestyle by choosing to fill my weekends with activities I enjoyed, such as basketball, chess, and spending time with my family. Focusing on these fun, non-gambling activities helped me to not think about betting. I never went back to betting on horse races once I was convinced that it did not work for me. I give myself the strength to stay away from it.
So Terry's story I found incredibly intriguing because he had very specific dates when he believed his gambling addiction started. And I think it was June 15th of 1997 or something like that, where him and his friends pooled a bunch of money together and bet on the horse race, and they were almost successful in winning millions of dollars. And this, unfortunately, is a trigger for a lot of people's gambling addiction. It may be the first time you get into horse race betting, it may be the first time you play poker, or the first time you go to a casino, and just by sheer luck you win some tournament, some jackpot, or some massive amount of money, and you think, oh man, I just started gambling. This is like the first time I placed a big bet, and I win all this free money. And you have this irrational thought in your mind that you found this easy way to make money. Now, the crazy part about this story was that Terry actually had a financial goal, and is that he wanted to achieve retirement, or he wanted to retire early, I guess you could say. Now, whenever you have some type of financial goal for your future, but it involves gambling as a component on how to get there, you're just setting yourself up for failure. And this story ended up being kind of sad because eventually Terry began to audit his life and his finances, and he realized that he had spent or lost over 500,000 Hong Kong dollars, and that his family wasn't talking to him as much anymore. And that's just when a gambling addiction becomes incredibly sad. And of course, Terry's road to recovery started when he decided to just give up on the horse races, and that he was going to spend the rest of his time focusing on playing basketball, chess, and spending more time with his family.
Managing a Double Life by Jan Brunswick, February 24th, 2022. At 18, I fell in love with a man who was quiet, kind, funny, and a bit of a rascal. Everyone liked him. He also liked drinking and gambling. Sure, we had plenty of good times, but gambling was like the third person in our marriage. There were some temporary splits, but the happily ever after dream I was chasing and promise of change kept pulling me back. I thought I could manage our double life because we got on well until I asked too many questions or a crisis exploded. Gambling confrontations were ugly. My reactions were fueled by fear, anger, and desperation with tears and pleading. Then came the grief, loneliness, indifference, or shutting down. I looked to the gambler to make me feel better. I would drive around gambling venues looking for him instead of sleeping. I would check his pockets looking for clues I hoped I'd never find. I was apprehensive about going to the mailbox. I panicked when the phone rang and I didn't recognize the voice. Or I made a nervous phone call to check on him if he wasn't home from work on time. Gambling was the glue that kept us together and the demon that tore us apart. As a mom, there was guilt. Were my kids' physical needs being met? Yes. Was I emotionally available? No, not enough. A sporting injury landed me in the hospital, but still my focus was entirely on my partner. Him being home alone rang huge alarm bells. I realized that I was also out of control. My life was unmanageable and I had to take responsibility for my own contribution to our problem. I sought the help of counselors, but while I was soaking up their words like a sponge, he was gambling even more. After 30 years together, I had no more chances left in my heart. I couldn't fix him. I was living my life in the hope of what it could have become, not what it was. I had to stop waiting for the future to deliver my happiness. I had to live in the present. The sliding door clicked shut. No fairy tale ending. My marriage was over. It hurt, but I let him go with a gut feeling that this was right for me. Now I can see my role in the gambling addiction cycle. My dream to stay together kept me totally focused on him. He created the crisis. I cleaned up the mess. I absorbed and hid the problem. I kept the skeleton in the cupboard. The shame and stigma turned me into a person who rescued him. I paid debts, covered for him, contacted banks or pawnbrokers, always with the hopes that this would be the last time. My naive thinking was that if the debt was gone, then so would the need to gamble. But actually, this enabled him to keep gambling. The pattern was gambling, anger and conflict, remorse, promises, rescuing, more gambling. It was cyclical. Moving on meant confronting my denial and changing my behavior. If nothing changes, nothing changes. A friend said to me, if you want to stop being the doormat, you'll need to get up off the floor. Reality was a hard life lesson. I had relapses that included wrestling with my past instinct that cried out, "Help him." I wrote down my emotions and worries, the positives and negatives. I had to accept that I couldn't change the gambling behavior. The only person I could change was myself. I had to stop accepting unacceptable behavior. I had to stop minimizing the harm. I had to not assume responsibility for issues that weren't mine to fix. I had to learn to focus on being kind to myself. My life was never all good nor all bad. I did the best I could with the tools and knowledge I had at the time. I was affected by gambling, but learned to separate the person from the behavior and recognize my own role in it. I found support. I attended counseling and 12-step programs to work on myself and continued to learn about gambling harm. I took a divorce and separation course along with a gambling harm program. I drew great strength listening to people in recovery and affected others. The feelings expressed were raw and without judgment, and so like my own. I felt I could be honest. It was okay to feel the way I did. I felt like I was finally home.
Okay, so Jan's story was very different than the rest, as she wasn't the one who had a gambling addiction and it was her husband. Now, this one was incredibly tough to read because it sounded like she cared so much for her husband and that she was trying to do anything she could to support him or to fix him or to alleviate any of these bad habits of gambling that he had. And after 30 years, she realized that she just couldn't fix him. And the sad part about this story was that she started to feel shame and guilt that she wasn't here emotionally for her kids and be more supportive of them. And this is so tough because it wasn't like she was the one that was placing bets. She wasn't the one that was gambling. And she wasn't the one that was neglecting her family. It was her husband. And it's sad because if there is someone close to you in your life that has a really serious addiction, they can just drag everyone else around them down with them. And I think the moral of the story is that you can't change someone else's gambling behavior unless they are the ones that want to take the initiative and fix it themselves. So that wraps it up, as these were 5 incredibly interesting gambling addiction short stories, and hopefully you learned something from each of them. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please let me know in the comment section down below, and if you want to watch another gambling addiction story video, you can watch that right here.